Welcome to program 3 of 8 of our Seeking Truth Through Facts U.S. China program series. Today's event is on the 5 dimensions of the Belt and Road Initiative. We'll hear the latest research from our very own Danny Russel, Vice President for International Security and Diplomacy at the Asia Society Policy Institute in New York. We have nearly 400 people signed up today. We welcome our audience from across our 13 global centers, including our trustees, advisory board members, groundbreaker members, and innovator members. Welcome also to our Seeking Truth Through Facts series sponsors, NEA, Magdalene Yum, and Lisa Berry. We are so grateful to all of you. For our VIPs, you should have received a second Zoom link for our VIP reception after this program. We'll continue the conversation in an off-the-record, on-camera format with Danny. I'm Margaret Connolly, Executive Director of our Northern California Center. Our format for this program, I'll introduce Danny very shortly. He'll give remarks, and then he'll take audience questions. If you have questions for Danny, please type them in the Q&A box. He'll get to as many of those questions as he can. We have an hour for this program. We'll end at 2 p.m. Pacific. That's 5 p.m. Eastern. This event is on the record, and we are recording. And now a few words about Danny Russel. Danny is the VP for International Security and Diplomacy at our Policy Institute. He has authored several reports on today's topic, including Navigating BRI and Weaponizing BRI. Today, we're going to get a sneak peek of the latest of what he's working on. Danny is a career member of the Senior Foreign Service at the U.S. Department of State and most recently served as the Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs. Before that, he served at the White House as Special Assistant to the President and National Security Council Senior Director for Asian Affairs. His impressive career includes international postings in Japan, the Netherlands, Cyprus, and South Korea. We are always so grateful to him for speaking at our center. Notably, the last time we had Danny here was in January when he moderated a joint interview with Secretary George Shultz and Dr. Henry Kissinger. If you haven't seen it, please check out that video. We're going to put the link in the chat box. That was the last time we heard from our honorary chair, Secretary Shultz. He passed away shortly after his centennial birthday, and it was indeed a very special moment. So Danny, we are so pleased to have you back. Thank you very much, and it's all yours.
Thank you so much, Margaret. I'm really happy to be here with you, and I appreciate you hosting me. I appreciate really all the terrific work that the Northern California Center, under your guidance and with your great leader, is doing. So thanks for having me. So I also spoke here about 2 years ago, and I talked about the Belt and Road, BRI. And I remember making an analogy between the BRI and a Rorschach test, an ink blot test. And my point was that people's perceptions of the BRI really are shaped by and say a lot about their perceptions of China itself. And I think 2 years later, that's still true to a certain extent, although as we get further and further into the lifespan of these Belt and Road projects, the initiative maybe is a little bit less of an ink blot and a little more of a snapshot in which some of the problems are visible. And there's been a lot written about all of the problems associated with Belt and Road projects: corruption, poor planning, unsustainable business models, environmental damage, adverse impact on local communities through also insufficient use of local labor or local procurement, so on. That said, there are also very successful BRI projects. And let's face it, in many places, not only do the governments want Chinese infrastructure investment, but China's often the only game in town. They're the only ones offering infrastructure deals and financing. I'd also say that, and this is shared by friends of mine who work for U.S. construction companies, that Chinese developers, the construction companies, are very competent. These projects themselves are often offered as package deals, so to speak, with the financing built in, the equipment, the operations, the training, turnkey projects. It's true, there's often a little something in there for the decision maker himself and his family to make the deal go smoothly, but that's true in a lot of the world. not limited to Chinese developers. I'd add that the turnaround time for the Chinese from, say, signing the deal to breaking ground on a project to ribbon cutting is infinitely quicker than what the World Bank can do or what Western development agencies can offer. Now, admittedly, sometimes those projects get stalled and never get completed because of the hurry at the front end, but that's one of the prices that you pay for the speed and the other advantages, and a lot of developing countries have experienced that now. Attitudes towards the BRI are mixed, to say the least. So some people see the initiative as demonstrating China's benevolence, its effort to deliver, desperately needed infrastructure development financing to emerging economies in Asia and Africa, Europe, the Americas, and that's certainly the Communist Party's line in China. At the other end of the spectrum, you've got people who see this as a very nefarious Chinese geopolitical gambit to trap and manipulate project host countries. And that's a perspective, frankly, that is shared by a lot of people in the Western national security community, including in Washington. My view is, look, don't treat BRI as a caricature. Don't dismiss it. Don't vilify it. Don't oversimplify it. And instead, look at what it really is. Try to make sense of it. Then that's why I'd like to unpack what I call the 5 dimensions that seem to make up the initiative. The first thing, though, for me to stress is that the BRI is an evolving enterprise. It takes on new attributes, it exploits new opportunities. You could kind of say it mutates. When BRI was first announced by President Xi Jinping back in 2013, it was basically a very vague slogan, and it pointed to big ticket infrastructure. It was aimed at connectivity projects building out from China's underdeveloped Western provinces. And I think it's well documented, it was driven mostly by the need to do something with China's glut of steel and concrete and labor, construction crews, oversupply, in other words. It also started as really just a patchwork of projects that were already underway overseas. And those projects were, let's say politely, of mixed quality. And something that I found was that, frankly, people in the Chinese government didn't really know all that much about the projects that were being undertaken, many of them self-declared as Belt and Road projects. But as soon as the Chinese development banks started handing out money, because Belt and Road is an initiative of the leader and that's the system in China, there was really just an avalanche of new projects, most funded by state banks, most of them run by the big state-owned enterprises, and most of them explicitly or implicitly insured against risk by the state. So since then, over 8+ years, the initiative has expanded immensely. There's something like 138 countries who have signed up to the Belt and Road. And it's not just a geographic expansion. Some agencies count in the order of 3,000 BRI projects and estimate their aggregate value in the neighborhood of over $3.8 trillion. And they include everything from ports and industrial parks to power plants and hydroelectric dams to tourism projects and stadiums and town centers and leaders, birthplace village. So to say that the BRI is complicated, multifaceted now is an understatement. It's really become a global enterprise, and it's expanded into areas like healthcare, digital technology, even outer space. But even as the Belt and Road moves into these new domains and creates these so-called new corridors, I think we're witnessing at the same time a form of integration of the different elements into a more cohesive brand of the Belt and Road. Because don't forget, Xi Jinping is a devout Marxist. He's a practicing Leninist. In other words, he's a big believer in consolidation, consolidating power, his power personally, consolidating the party's power, consolidating China's power, putting every possible tool to work in support of the national rejuvenation project led by the Chinese Communist Party. You know, he has repeated over and over again his call for close coordination between the military struggle, as he calls it, and the political track, the diplomatic track, economic, legal, cultural. He's shown his determination to try to foster first a regional and, if possible, a global environment that's comfortable for China, that's conducive to its ambitions. And that objective of his has definitely affected the trend lines and I think the nature of the Belt and Road. Now, that said, and I know I'm doing a little one hand, the other hand here, but I don't want to make it sound like this is some exquisitely orchestrated, you know, strategy developed by fiendish masterminds in Beijing. It's not. There is an awful lot in the BRI that just does not work. And there's a lot that may still go very wrong with the BRI, especially in the wake of COVID-19 and the various effects that it's having on China and around the world. But the perception from outside China at least suggests very close coordination and oversight, whereas in reality, I think what we're seeing, despite Xi Jinping's push to centralize all the decision-making, is that there are a lot of cooks in the Belt and Road kitchen, a lot of different Chinese actors and stakeholders. You've got the state-owned enterprises, you've got the finance ministry, commerce ministry, other ministries. You've got the very powerful NDRC, the National Development and Reform Commission. You've got the policy banks, China Exim Bank, China Development Bank, and so on. And you've got the provincial governments, which themselves run many and finance many of the Belt and Road projects. And on top of that, you got private developers. So sometimes it looks like they are not all singing from the same sheet or not working together. They can be oblivious to what the other actors are doing. And at times they are, surprise, surprise, working at cross purposes with each other. Well, you know, I touched very briefly on COVID-19. Let me just make a point with respect to the pandemic, namely that COVID-19 has had a negative impact on China's national budget, meaning that politically now there is less tolerance than there had been for massive foreign projects that hemorrhage state money without any real prospect of repayment or, you know, turning a profit, or frankly, without any perceived benefit to the middle class in China. Middle classes are the same around the world. Like, why are you spending money in that foreign rat hole? Why don't you put it in my neighborhood? COVID, at the same time, has been even more of a disaster for the national budgets of the countries in the developing world, meaning that Beijing is, first of all, finding it much, much harder to sell big ticket projects that lower income countries really can't afford. It's also finding it pretty difficult to keep the ones they've already got going afloat in the face of massive loan defaults. I think an additional factor is that in many parts of the world, the virus unleashed really nasty anti-China or anti-Chinese and anti-Asian racism. And we saw threats, attacks, and then a whole host of problems, not just for the Chinese workers and the managers, but for the projects themselves. And, you know, the early Chinese face mask diplomacy and then the subsequent vaccine diplomacy, you know, they've had mixed results. And in the first case, there were reports about defective PPE items. Later, Sinovac was shown to have a very low, comparatively low efficacy rate and so on. But now China is really powering ahead with the health Silk Road, as they put it, the part of the BRI that aims to bolster China's reputation and its influence, but also addressing a global need and strengthening its commercial clout as a global medical supplier. Another mutation, another variant of BRI is its move into the digital space. And this is something that my team and I are hard at work at right now. The digital Silk Road is helping facilitate China's expanding presence in the global tech market. It's allowing them to establish themselves as the first choice, in some cases, the only choice for new technologies and new systems. And these, you know, range from telecom to data management to facial recognition and AI surveillance and AI-driven censorship. And many of these technologies are packaged in kind of standalone initiatives, such as what they call the Smart Cities program or the Safe Cities program. And I'll come back to those later. But anyway, I promised 5 dimensions to the PRIs, so let me start ticking through the numbers. The first one I'd flag is the goal of regional development. And look, much of BRI's early investments were in China's own neighborhood in Southeast Asia and Central Asia, still are. The point is that China's economic miracle largely bypassed the remote Western provinces like Xinjiang, and unrest in ethnic populations like the Uyghurs made Chinese leaders very uneasy, to say the least. So for them, supporting development in the neighboring countries that are closely tied geographically with the problem areas not only connects to the national goal of alleviating poverty within China, but it also very much connects to the goal of stabilizing turbulent border areas, which typically are pretty porous. When it comes to regional development, look, I'd say at best, this is a mixed picture. Maybe that is generous. There seems to be clear evidence that Chinese entities have derived far more value from these projects than the nations that host the projects. I've seen studies, for example, that show that something in the neighborhood, when you average it out, 89 to 90% of the contractors in BRI projects writ large are Chinese firms. And fewer than 8% of the contractors are from the host country, the country where the project is taking place. And even then, one of the things that we found in our earlier work is that those contracts are almost exclusively at the far low end of the service ladder. So it's security guards, it's drivers, it's cooks, it's janitors, gardeners, that sort of thing. So in our 2019 study, which was navigating the Belt and Road, as Margaret mentioned, we found on quite a few projects, even in China's own neighborhood, that were not environmentally or socially or financially or commercially viable. And many of these projects were rushed through without doing even basic due diligence. It was very rare that we found evidence that financial or commercial viability studies had been done, or environmental or social impact studies had been done. And where we found an environmental impact survey in one project, we were able to read it, we found it had just been copied from a different project. And you want to know how we know? Because whoever was doing the update got tired of cut and paste at some point, and towards the end, it reverted to the original project name. That said, not the Chinese are not to blame for all the things that go wrong in Belt and Road projects by a long shot. And again, what we found was that the host country actors, the local officials, central government officials, local land developers, and so on, they cut corners. They made compromises that were not in the interests of the country and their citizens, and they often ignored agreements or failed to uphold laws that were really their responsibility, not the Chinese. But at the same time, we saw that Chinese developers tended to kind of hide behind this laissez-faire rationale that, hey, local labor laws, that's not our responsibility. Environmental laws, that's for the host government, and so on. And like the villagers got evicted without compensation. Hey, look at the contract. It says that the host government's supposed to pay fair prices for the real estate needed for the project. So, that's not on us. And they also pointed out, look, the local officials agreed to non-competitive bidding. They agreed to negligible level of local procurement. They agreed to a huge influx of Chinese laborers to build the projects, and these various things that prevented the local communities from benefiting from the project. But the point is that when local backlash, community reactions slowed a project or stalled out the project, then the Chinese developers began to lose money. And the Chinese development banks became very unhappy with the cost to the national treasury, and that Chinese government officials were unhappy about the damage to China's reputation. When I visited Beijing to brief a number of senior officials on my findings, I made the point that China might not be legally responsible for many of these things going wrong. But what we found was that in the country, by the local communities, China was being held responsible. And that resonated. I think the officials in Beijing understood that problem. And so that and a combination of other factors seem to be pushing the Chinese authorities gradually to become more attentive to development standards. The second dimension, I would say, is geopolitics. And by geopolitics, I mean a mix of political and security interests and capabilities. Now, the Chinese government has a very understandable fixation with its own neighborhood, right? Its perimeter. China shares land borders with 14 countries. It shares maritime borders with 7 more countries. Not all of those countries are particularly friendly. Not all of them are totally stable. So there's plenty to worry about. And on top of that, there's the presence of the United States in the region. And not just the United States, but backed by Japan, Australia, a lot of powerful actors. So take a minute and ask yourself, why did the movie Wolf Warrior smash all box office records in China? It's because, look, the threat from abroad, the threat of foreign invasion or foreign subversion is so deeply rooted in Chinese historical consciousness. And, you know, the CCP is making sure nobody forgets because it's also pretty deeply rooted in Chinese propaganda. So it shouldn't be a surprise that BRI is used to secure China's periphery, to advance Chinese national geopolitical objectives in Asia and more recently beyond Asia. From the Western perspective, BRI's impact on the geopolitical environment is partly a function of China's growing capabilities in the maritime domain, and partly a function of its growing capabilities in the cyber domain. So Margaret also mentioned another report that we did last year called Weaponizing the Belt and Road. There we took a look at how China is using the BRI port projects to expand military capabilities that are useful both in economic terms, but also useful to China's national security. And at the same time, and this is a project that we're hoping to roll out in early November called Stacking the Deck, we're seeing China's digital and cyber capabilities being strengthened and extended via the digital Silk Road, and also, like, put on your seatbelt, the space and information corridor. So not only do these programs help push China to the forefront of technology, but they also lock host states into these systems for the future. And that has more than just commercial implications, although it has big commercial implications. Another thing that's relevant is the advancement of what China calls civil-military fusion. And this is a policy backed by law in China that blurs the line between commercial, military, and strategic, whether it's a project or a goal. So the BRI ports that are being constructed around, say, the Indian Ocean are being developed with dual use capabilities, meaning they're being designed for both commercial and strategic or overtly military capabilities. And they're not military naval bases the way that the US has naval bases, but they're definitely designed to support the Chinese military's logistics network and therefore its ability to project power and conduct operations further and further away from the Chinese mainland. And, the expansion of those military capabilities is something that could constrict US and other countries' freedom of movement in the Indo-Pacific. But the BRI ports themselves are just one component of a whole suite of BRI assets that serve as platforms for leverage and for influence. They include the digital Silk Road, as I mentioned. Within that, Huawei networks, the smart city surveillance technologies, and the Beidou satellite system. The point is that the influence that Beijing can derive from the entire BRI network adds up to persuasion or sometimes coercion with various countries to create a more compliant environment. These are building blocks of what looks to me like a Sinocentric ecosystem that structurally favors Beijing's agenda. And to the extent that Beijing can be successful in leveraging BRI for geopolitical advantage, the ability of the United States, as it has historically, to safeguard regional stability and peace is called into question. The third dimension I'll touch on is, as I was just speaking of, technology. So I talked about the digital Silk Road and its role in BRI, how it helps to export Chinese technology, how it embeds Chinese influence and cyber standards. So China has a stated goal of becoming a cyber great power. And this is a long-term play. It's supported by the rapid technology growth within China. And the digital Silk Road is the supply chain to BRI countries for technologies I've mentioned, safe cities, smart cities. These, just to unpack them a little bit, these are integrated platforms that include things like data centers, 5G telecom, AI-driven facial recognition tech, and other tools for tracking, monitoring, censoring citizens. They also, these programs also insert Chinese companies along with Chinese technology into the information streams of these countries so that China can vacuum up huge quantities of very valuable data that's extremely useful to Chinese actors. That brings me, I think, to the fourth dimension, which is the commercial dimension. So Chinese commercial enterprises were obviously active around the world long before BRI was a thing. And in fact, as I alluded to, the first phase of BRI was mostly just slapping a Belt and Road label on projects that Chinese businesses already had underway. But as I described, BRI has evolved, and now it's really having an impact on the flow of international commerce, and it's helping in many different ways to expand Chinese firms' overseas activities at present. For one thing, there's a heavy focus in BRI on transportation, and by constructing ports and highways and rail lines, China's created opportunities for its companies to get goods to market and to facilitate import of necessary raw materials in the other direction. I think this infrastructure in particular helps China to reorient global commerce, to gain commercial advantages over competitors, certainly lowering overall costs. And in part, it creates an advantage by securing more access for Chinese businesses in the local economies of Belt and Road countries on every continent. So beyond the transportation sector, we're seeing Chinese firms plan and finance and construct BRI projects, and then those BRI projects can funnel further business opportunities to more Chinese companies to sell product or to provide services. And both state-owned enterprises and private firms, to the extent that they are private firms in China, have benefited. So look at Huawei, look at ZTE, but also look at Alibaba, look at Tencent, and look now why you can still find them. When you examine the BRI ports in South Asia and Africa and the Middle East, where Chinese companies have nearly all of the operating contracts for the ports, or you look at the many, many business parks that are developed usually in tandem with a transportation system like a port, you're seeing that increasingly these business parks or zones are hosting dozens and dozens of Chinese companies. There's an additional aspect, which is China's growing ability to provide tech-based banking systems to like e-payment platforms, and at some point provide the digital yuan to pull millions of users into China's financial network. So what's so important about this is that these technologies give China access to an incredible amount of data, and it's data from a very diverse set of users, which is something that the Chinese firms can't get at home. So, and you won't be surprised to learn that this massive trove of big data sooner or later winds up in the hands of key agencies in Beijing. And lastly, it's not just that Chinese companies have significantly increased commercial opportunities throughout the developing world, but also that the BRI provides Beijing with some commercial advantages that it can use to freeze out competitors from other countries in some markets. So I'm on number 5 now. I know I'm speaking for a long time. So physicists postulate the existence of a 5th dimension. I'm going to do the same. And to me, the 5th dimension is the U.S. China relationship. So I've described some of the ways in which the impact of the Belt and Road can conflict with U.S. interests. Common sense tells us that as the bilateral relationship between the two countries deteriorates, that China has an incentive to use BRI as an asset in strategic competition. Not surprisingly, we're also seeing US-led efforts to try to compete with BRI or to create credible, high-quality alternatives for developing countries. One form this is taken is the Build Back Better World, the B3W initiative announced by the Biden administration not long ago. And the idea being, let's collaborate with partners like the EU, Australia, Japan to increase infrastructure, make foundational investments in low-income countries, and to mobilize private sector capital in areas like climate, health, digital technology, and so on. So it's still premature to judge whether the B3W is going to get off the ground and what it's going to amount to and how quickly it can get mobilized and so on. I don't think it's intended as a one-to-one alternative to Belt and Road, but more as a source of financing and technical support in some priority areas. But look, there are a lot of ways for the US and China to compete that are really frightening and dangerous. So if the West, led by Washington, wants to compete with China by throwing resources behind climate resilience and global health, hey, go for it. I'm all for that. And if that form of competition were to drive Beijing to up its own game and make good on promises of a green BRI and a health BRI, or, for example, to announce that it's curtailing financing of coal-fired plants in future BRI projects, then what's not to like about that? So I've gone on for a long time. I want to hear your comments and try to answer your questions, but let me just close with this one point. BRI has all kinds of shortcomings. Beijing has made a lot of pledges to improve it. Right now, they're more in the zone of promises and of facts on the ground. But look, the developing world needs infrastructure desperately, and equally to the point, BRI ain't going away. Not as long as Xi Jinping is running China, which is looking to be for quite a while to come yet. So in my view, what Western countries ought to be working towards is helping to create a better BRI, not helping to undercut or destroy BRI. Because, as I said, the world really needs infrastructure financing, development, sustainable development, responsible development, corruption-free development. So try to push it in that direction. And if initiatives like B3W can provide more opportunities for countries to access funding and can help raise the standards within the BRI as well, this would be, if you'll forgive me for using a Chinese expression, a big win-win. All right. So let me stop there, turn things back to you, Margaret.
Well, Danny, thank you very much. We do have some questions that have come in the chat box. Let's see. We have one from Gary Reichel, our chair.
Oh, no, don't start with the hard one.
Do you see it there? Or do you want me to read it out for you?
Please read it if you don't mind.
Okay. What kind of institutional response do we need to create in the US to the BRI initiatives? Do we need to create a new agency? Is there an ability to create within commerce or state something that would tie together in the necessary components? A worry is that the work required to change our own institutions to respond is more difficult than the response itself. And he thanks you for your time.
Well, thanks, Gary. Leave it to you to ask me the tough one. I tried to at least make a start at addressing that at the end of my remarks before you asked your question, but I'll take it a little bit further. Look, I'm not a big believer in head-to-head competition. My background is Aikido, the Japanese martial art that is built around the principle of using your opponent's momentum and force against him, not like karate where you punch straight at him. And as a result, my thinking is, first of all, as I said, we should want to make BRI better, not to try to, Godzilla meets Bambi, stomp it out of existence. It's no Bambi, that's for sure, and it ain't going away. Second of all, the flaws in the BRI generate real suffering and damage to the communities where the projects are being built. And there are a lot of corrupt governments, but there's no government that doesn't care about its own sovereignty, that doesn't, if possible, want to do right by the nation and its citizens. But there are many underdeveloped or less developed nations whose governments just don't have the bandwidth or the expertise to deal with the complications of negotiating with Chinese developers. They don't know what the contract law is. They may not even really have a very well-developed national set of infrastructure priorities. So like the old, Avon lady of yore, when the doorbell rings and somebody says, ding dong, here is a prefabricated dam, high-speed rail, whatever, just sign on the dotted line, it's yours for no money down, $99 a month for the rest of eternity. That's a pretty good deal, and nobody else is offering that. If we, as the United States or as allied democracies, can offer expert support and assistance to the recipient governments themselves, they will negotiate in their own interests. They will push for a better deal, a fairer shake. We've already seen that in Sri Lanka. We've seen that in Myanmar when Aung San Suu Kyi came to power. We've seen that in Malaysia when Najib was, perp-walked off in handcuffs. I'm not saying that we shouldn't do more in development. Absolutely, we should. I think there's room for dramatic reforms in the way that the World Bank and the IMF address infrastructure needs. Your question gets at a real problem, which is sort of disconnections within or among American agencies. There's also a lot of redundancy or incompatibility between what the Japanese and the Koreans and the Australians and we may be doing, often in the same country. And there's the host country's clever ability to sort of leverage one of us against the other so that they wind up with two bridges across the river instead of one Chinese, one Japanese. But fundamentally, I think it's like planning experts, engineers, lawyers, economists, city planners, and they can be made available maybe as a flying, squad that comes into a country, spends 3 months working with or 6 months working with the officials there, augments their capacity, their know-how, brings with them some standard contracts, including information or contracts that are derived from China's own domestic laws, which are pretty strict. I don't mean to go on, but we found an example in which an identical dam was dams were built in Yunnan, Yunnan province and in northern Cambodia. The one in Yunnan province, same blueprint, same everything, was magnificent. The one that was built in Cambodia was littered with problems. So it's not the engineering, it's not the blueprint. There's more to it than that.
To your point on that, Danny, until your new report, Stacking the Deck, comes out in November, there's a question here from Ramnath asking, would be interested in knowing if there are any databases that update on BRI projects by China, which differentiates from non-BRI projects of China. So where can we find more info?
Yeah, well, I'll have to try to post some of the links after this program that would help on that. What I will do, though, is to make the point that you need really a seer with telepathic superpowers to be able to divine what is and what isn't a BRI project. On one trip to Beijing, I put that very question to all of the different vice ministers that I met with, including in the NDRC, including in the International Liaison Department of the party itself, the China Development Bank, MOFCOM, and so on, Finance Ministry. Absolutely nobody on the Chinese side could answer the question, what is a BRI project and what isn't? But, you know, that's kind of the part of the I call it sort of the beauty of China, which is that some things are crystal clear and some things are very murky. In effect, I think the answer is, you know, gradually over time, clarity will emerge as to what is, in fact, a BRI project. And as I've said, we've seen it mutate and we've seen it gain greater definition. I mean, the short answer is, if it's successful, it's a BRI project. If it's not, well, you know, nobody's going to really talk much about its connection to that signature project of the great leader, Xi Jinping. So there are a number of think tanks and academic sources that have analyzed different projects and have made a stab at differentiating. But last time I looked, there still is no real Chinese database of BRI projects, which is something that we at ASPI had advocated for when we held our discussions with Chinese decision makers.
Great. From Kenny Chin, would a successful BRI become China's soft power alternative to military adventurism as a way to global development?
Yeah, I don't know anybody who thinks that that military adventurism is a pathway to global development. But certainly, Belt and Road is, among other things, an effort by Chinese leaders to differentiate China from the United States. And you don't have to be a reader of Global Times to hear and to see the vigor with which they're making the case that America is all about blowing things up and destroying countries. We're all about building things and bolstering countries. America is all about hectoring people for human rights. The real human rights is giving opportunity and, you know, dams and highways and transportation connectivity to impoverished people in the developing world. And, you know, there's something to be said for that, no question about it. The factor that is hamstringing this Chinese effort, I mean, yeah, it's propaganda, but one person's propaganda is another person's heartfelt truth. But what's undercutting the effectiveness of this message, which you would think is not that hard to get across. If I'm the guy building a bridge and he's the guy using a drone to blow up a vehicle that turns out not to be the terrorists, you ought to be able to make that case. But what's undercutting them is the melange, the mix of technical failures in BRI projects. And I would consider it a failure if 500 people in a village in Cambodia or in Sri Lanka are forcibly removed from their ancestral homeland, not compensated, and then arrested or threatened with guns if they complain. Like, that's not a success. Nor is a project that gets stalled or stopped because it was designed to cross ethnic boundaries in an area of ethnic strife, and it just can't work. Nor is a project that puts a high-speed rail line through a jungle and posits a station in the middle of that jungle with no access, no nearby towns, no economy to connect to it. The second, I think, kind of problem setback that is making it hard for the Chinese to make that case is their proclivity to use coercion and what I was brought up to call bullying when countries irritate them by violating these sacred precepts the Chinese call core interests. By saying the wrong thing about Hong Kong, saying the wrong thing about Taiwan, or about the situation in Xinjiang with the Uyghur minorities and so on. There isn't a lot of flexibility in the Chinese system to tolerate that kind of deviation from the line. And the tendency to come down very, very hard on people, officials, groups, organizations, governments that aren't sufficiently careful or loyal to the Chinese dictum. That also is badly undercutting China's image as a benevolent donor.
From A. Vaish, it seems that China understands the extreme value of data. You talked about technology quite a bit today. What should the U.S. do to safeguard and compete in this vital resource management?
Wow, that's even a harder question than Gary's.
Good audience today.
Yeah. Well, look, that's a brilliant question, and I wish I had an equally brilliant answer. There's an innate asymmetry and a paradox here in that China is a society in which the government has really unrestricted access to private personal information among its citizens. And the United States and Europe, although there are areas where they differ, and the other Western democracies have a strong commitment to personal privacy and have pretty dramatic limits on what corporations, and especially on what the U.S. government or what the government can access in terms of personal data and personal information. And we want to be careful that in defending ourselves against what is, in fact, a very deliberate and very systematic and very widespread policy of intrusion and exfiltration. Those are sort of euphemisms for theft of personal data, that we don't turn ourselves into China, that we don't become a closed, essentially a non-free society in which we put stark limits on the access to data by others or the access to information by others, while at the same time running roughshod over our own citizens' privacy. So it's a really tough one. The general guiding principle, I think, always needs to be what Bob Gates long ago articulated as small yard, high fence. In other words, figure out what it is that you really need to protect. Number one, that's the small yard. Don't try to protect things that are going to be obsolete or that are in the public domain or whatever, aren't that important. And the high fence is make sure you're actually protecting it, like be smart about it. Those are two really important points on the defense side. The other side, I won't exactly call it offense, but on the activist side, there is much more that the U.S. could do to sort of compete in the access to data race with China. There's one reason why we're perhaps not as good, and there's another reason why it doesn't matter. We're not as good at this as the Chinese are because we don't have state-run enterprises. The US government doesn't get to tell private companies, we want you to go to Africa and we want you to build these networks and we want you to collect all the information that you possibly can overtly, and we'll piggyback and do the covert stuff ourselves. We can't do that. But on the flip side of it, America's greatest strength, and this is something I know that Margaret is passionate about, is our diversity. And just in our little corner of 330 million people, I realize that's tiny by Chinese standards, but we have a hell of a lot of diversity. The reason that China is in need of so much external data is twofold. One, because there's a lot about the world that they don't know, and we have a huge head start on them. But number two, it's because their data set, they may have 1.4 billion examples of any kind of data, but it's a very homogeneous group, notwithstanding the ethnic differences within China. So it's a complicated picture. And as I said, I don't have a perfect answer, but it's one that policymakers are definitely wrestling with.
Okay, last question in this last minute that we have, Danny. It's from Don Emerson and Eva Huang. Is how can the U.S. help the BRI without furthering the geopolitical ambition towards greater influence and control that you have already talked about?
Hi, Don. Well, I think number one, as I said, by strengthening the capacity of BRI recipient countries to defend their own interests and to negotiate agreements or renegotiate agreements to ensure that the projects are sustainable, are environmentally sound, are financially viable, et cetera. Secondly, I think that there are ways that we can muster pressure, positive pressure on the Chinese when it comes to BRI. The problem with the BRI proliferating coal-fired plants is not a new one. It's something that has been raised not just by ASPI, but by the U.S. government and John Kerry and many others. The Japanese and the Koreans earlier this year made a decision at government level to stop funding coal-fired plants in their own development projects. The upcoming COP26 in Scotland, I think, added to the pressure. And thus we heard at the UN, Xi Jinping at long last making this announcement about the BRI. There's some lessons to be learned in how you influence the Chinese decisions about the direction of BRI without either vilifying it, as I said, or endorsing it.
Well, thank you very much, Danny. We had a lot more questions that we just didn't have time to get to, but we are going to be keeping our eyes peeled for Stacking the Deck, your report that's going to come out in the coming months. Please keep us posted, and we'll keep our audience posted as well. As a reminder, if you received an email to join our VIP reception, please click over to that second Zoom link right now. We're going to continue our conversation in an off-the-record format on camera with Danny, and we can get to more of those questions. Thank you again to our Seeking Truth Through Facts series sponsors, NEA, Magdalene Yum, and Lisa Berry. And thank you to our Asia Society Northern California team, Russel Uy, Angela Chung, James Gale, Michael Chong, and to all of our interns. And from all of us at the Northern California Center, stay safe.